to extend a warm welcome to everyone that is on this webinar. Before the presentation, I will give some instructions. Please silence all noise-making devices. It's important that we keep all background noises to a minimum because we will be taping this webinar. You wish to mute your telephones until you're ready to ask questions at the appropriate points. I will be your chairperson for today's webinar. I'm founder and president of Putting Rare Diseases Patients First. Registered pharmacist, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry since the late 80s, and I am considered an expert in regulatory affairs and drug development. Interest in developing new and effective medicines for rare and neglected diseases. I wrote a book some years ago called Clinical Trials, What Patients and Healthy Volunteers Need to Know, and published by a major publisher, Oxford University Press. And then I wrote the book is because I want to see patients and parents of children with all sorts of illnesses, but especially rare diseases, empowered. That's why I'm really pleased that we have two special speakers here today, and Amanda Baylog and Stephanie DeWard, both a company called GeneDx, a company that specializes in diagnosing genetic diseases. The title of this webinar is What in the World is Wrong with Me? Of this webinar, this is the 7th in a series, and we have a planned series of webinars we're working through. And the goal of the webinars is, as I've mentioned, to empower patients, to empower parents of children with rare diseases. And we're covering special subjects based on my experience in the pharmaceutical industry and also as a pharmacist, understanding what patients and parents need when they're walking through this journey of rare disease. So I'll go through a few preliminaries, and then I will introduce our speakers, and they will be tag teaming. And we will have the presentation, and then we'll go through some Q&A, questions and answers, and then we will close. I anticipate we will need 1 hour and 50 minutes today, and we won't keep you longer than that. And please try to focus your attention on this today. I know that it's a weekend when there are lots of festivities, but I do believe that this is an important subject, and I'm really pleased our speakers have made the time, even given the holiday weekend. Putting Rare Diseases Patients First is a non-profit. It was formed in 2014. It has tax-exempt status in California and from the IRS. And we're providing free educational content to patients with rare diseases and the parents of children with rare diseases. We have a direct-to-patient strategy, and the reason is when we give this information, it's information that has been carefully created and customized for the patient or the parent. We don't want to give the information to an intermediary because that information could then be filtered and adjusted. We want to give it directly because it is what you can use immediately after you've heard it. These are the other subjects we plan to cover, and there's a list of subjects on the website which will give you the details later that we have already covered. That we cannot give medical advice about your specific situation. We will, if you ask a question about your medical situation or your clinical situation, we will rephrase the question so we can address it in relation to a general patient situation. do that is obviously we don't know your individual situation and we don't want to mislead you. And also we want to make sure that everyone gets the benefit of the information we're sharing. So what is wrong with me? One is this subject that shows that patients with rare diseases can go through a number of misdiagnoses before they're finally given the correct diagnosis, if they are given a correct diagnosis. And very typical for many patients with rare diseases. On the meeting today or on the webinar today may have gone through that similar situation. The process of achieving a diagnosis can take months or even years. Patients with rare diseases say they even have a celebration after they finally receive a diagnosis and they have finally been given the information that puts the jigsaw puzzle together. Consider the case of a child with a rare disease. The sooner an accurate diagnosis is given, the earlier it is possible to intervene or to determine the best intervention. If then the disease progress rapidly to a point where intervention will no longer be feasible or effective. I'm of patients and the parents taking control of their rare disease situation or any disease situation. That there are amazing advances being made in the area of genetic code understanding and the understanding of the impact of that genetic code on disease. And developments are making a huge difference in the lives of many patients. And yet many patients and the parents are still unaware of what is available to them. You're here today are two speakers. So our first speaker is Amanda Baylog. She's the genetic counselor at GeneDx. And you can see from her background, she has had quite an amount of schooling and education in this field. Prior to coming or working at GeneDx, Amanda worked as a metabolic and research genetic counselor at O&O Alpen, where she was part of the lysosomal storage disease research and treatment unit. Steph is lead genetic counselor in the whole exome sequencing program at GeneDx. And like Amanda, she's also had a lot of schooling and education in this field. She's a licensed and certified genetic counselor and has worked for several years as a genetic counselor in pediatric and general genetic clinics, and also as a clinical research coordinator of studies for patients with inborn errors of metabolism. Extremely qualified, and I know that they have the support of the Chief Medical Officer to be here today and to present on behalf of GeneDx. I'm really pleased to welcome them. I would like to start with a few questions about our speakers' personalities and what they do outside of work, because I know we have activities and hobbies and jobs, but we also do things outside of work. So, Amanda, maybe we could start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do in your spare time when you're not working at GeneDx?
Sure. So my hobbies outside of GeneDx are a grandmotherly sort. So I do knitting and crocheting and canning and needlepoint and really going beyond my years, but it's what I enjoy.
Okay, cool. And Stephanie, what about you?
I'm son, so most of my quote-unquote free time is spent with my family. We also love to travel, so my husband and I are currently soliciting suggestions on places we should go on a bucket list of family vacations to do with our sons before they graduate from high school.
Oh, that's great. And that's really exciting. I don't know if the audience has anything to ask, but we'll give you a second or so to ask your question if you have any questions. But wanted to ask is that both in the field of genetic counseling, can you both tell us a little bit, Amanda first, what brought you into this field of genetic counseling?
So I knew when I went into undergrad that I wanted to do something sciencey. I started out as a biochemistry major, and I was leaning towards, being a derm, being pre-med. But as I started to shadow physicians, I saw that they got limited time with patients and didn't have the time to develop that relationship that I sort of wanted. And so in my senior year, I found out about genetic counseling through on children with disability, and I saw that they spent a large amount of time with patients and, explaining diagnoses, explaining test options, and giving them the information they need to make decisions about their own health care. I found that was perfect for me because I got to do the sciencey things that I really, really enjoyed, but I still got to see the direct impact of science and medicine on patients and their care.
Wonderful.
Stephanie, what about you?
My story is somewhat similar to Amanda's. I fell in love with genetics in the 8th grade when I first learned about it, and I just thought if there was anything I could study and be interested about for the rest of my life, it would be how does this thing called a gene work, and why am I different than other members of my family? And then in high school, through a career search engine, I heard about genetic counseling, and I read about how healthcare professionals who work with patients and families, explaining to them genetic testing, explaining to them complicated medical information, and that just seemed like the perfect fit for me of the science that I loved and the interaction with patients and helping people through difficult times in their lives that I was really drawn to.
Wonderful. That's really exciting. It's always nice when you land where you always wanted to be, and you're also helping patients, which is why we all do what we're doing. So while you're telling us a little bit about what genetic counseling is, we'll start with Amanda, if you could do that. I will switch the slides and bring up your slides. So, Amanda, what is genetic counseling? And then Stephanie can fill in any gaps that you've left.
So genetic counselors are professionals who are specially trained in genetics to explain genetic information to patients, to give them the information that they need to make decisions about health care, whether that's management decisions with treatment or testing options, where to take all the information that's available and put it in context and try to find answers for patients. Counselors generally start with an undergraduate degree in biology or psychology and then go to a master's program specifically for genetic counseling, and then generally are board certified. And they work in a variety of settings, from prenatal to pediatrics, cancer, or like Stephanie and I in a genetics testing laboratory where we get to help interpret what's out of the laboratory and put it into a cohesive and coherent report that patients can understand.
Wonderful. And Stephanie, do you want to add anything to that?
You covered it quite well.
Okay, good. So now that we've learned a little bit about Amanda and Stephanie, I'm really pleased that we can go straight into the presentation. And it is a very important presentation, so I know that in today's day we're always tweeting and doing all sorts of things while we're focusing on watching TV or something else, watching YouTube or Netflix. But this is an important subject, so I would really encourage you to focus your 100% attention on this presentation, because it may give you information that might make a difference to whatever it is that you're dealing with, or that your child is dealing with, or that you're planning to do in terms of your activities where you're working with patients. or your child's situation. So I'm going to hand over to Amanda. I will be changing the slides, and then we'll hand over to Stephanie in a seamless way, hopefully. And so we'll start with Amanda. Go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thanks to Putting Rare Disease Patients First for inviting us here to talk to you all today. The focus on our talk today is a new genetic test called whole exome sequencing and the role that it has to play for finding diagnoses for patients with rare diseases. Next. So first, Stephanie and I are employees of GeneDx, which is a molecular diagnostic testing laboratory that is a subsidiary of OPKO Health. And also the information that we'll be presenting today is our experience at GeneDx with whole exome sequencing, and that experience can vary from laboratory to laboratory. All right, next. And we'd everyone who has helped us to our presentation, the patients and the families who've shared their stories, as Jane and Bethany and our exome team, and Anna who helped put together the slides for this presentation. Next. So we'll start talking about a little girl named Katie. Katie was healthy and developed normally for about the first year of life, but when her parents noticed she wasn't walking at 18 months, she began physical therapy to help her learn. And she still wasn't walking. Katie's pediatrician referred her to be evaluated by neurologists. And this noticed some other health concerns that Katie had developed. She had trouble with balance and coordination. She had tremor, or her hands were shaking when she reached out. She had low muscle tone and some of the skills she previously had developed. After these concerns, the pediatric neurologist ordered an MRI and an MRS of Katie's brain. And that showed something called cerebral degeneration, which means a problem with the part of the brain that controls fine motor skills and coordination. As part of it, they also took a family history, and that no one else in Katie's family had similar health concerns. So after these evaluations, she was given a clinical diagnosis of a condition called fetal neuronal dystrophy. And this is a progressive, eventually fatal disorder, and the only treatment is to support the child with physical therapy and parents were home and love your child because there's nothing else that can be done. So as part of it, Katie had extensive testing. So she has testing for neuronal dystrophy. She has a test called a microarray, which is one of the basic genetic tests. She had skin biopsy, and more invasive muscle biopsy was also recommended, but parents declined since she'd already been through so much as part of this evaluation. At a lumbar puncture was an unpleasant procedure where they sample the fluid that surrounds the spinal cord and brain. And the total cost was almost $70,000. But none of these tests confirmed that clinical diagnosis of neuronal dystrophy. Next. So in a search for a firm, physicians recommended a new type of testing called whole exome sequencing. So we bring to Katie and her family after Stephanie tells you a bit more about what whole exome sequencing is. Stephanie?
Setting the stage for us. So today, sort of behind the scenes look at what whole exome sequencing is, what's the process, what is this technology, and how is it used in rare diseases patients, and how can it be used to come to a diagnosis for patients like KB. We'll show you the GeneDx experience and some of the data that we have accumulated by doing whole exome sequencing in our laboratory, and talk about future directions of the testing. After that, we'll go back to KB's story to sort of hear what her whole exome sequencing showed. Whole exome involves genetic testing of the protein coding regions of the human genome. Your body is made of millions of cells, and inside those cells is your DNA, your genetic material. Your genetic material is collectively referred to as the human genome, and it's packaged in these things known as genes. Genes are sort of like recipes or instructions for your body to grow and develop. We think we currently have about 20,000 genes, but a quarter of these have been associated with human disease to date. That means that the majority of genes, we don't know exactly how they function or what they do, and we don't know exactly what clinical symptoms can arise if there's a disruption of that gene. Select is used to make a diagnosis. So this is used to identify the genetic change that's responsible for clinical symptoms that a person is experiencing. In addition, whole exome sequencing can be used to identify secondary or incidental findings. These are clinically significant variants that are not obviously related to the symptoms that the patient has right now. We'll talk about both of these in much more detail. Would consider whole exome sequencing. Probably the most common is one like KB, a patient who's been on what's commonly called a diagnostic odyssey. These are people who have seen doctors, sometimes lots of doctors, and they've had genetic testing, sometimes lots of genetic testing, and there hasn't been a definitive diagnosis made to this point. They're still searching for the genetic cause for the symptoms that they're experiencing. Patients that's a good candidate for whole exome sequencing are patients who have disorders with lots of genes associated with them. An example is mitochondrial disease. A patient could have mitochondrial disease, but there are hundreds of genes that have been shown to cause disorders of the mitochondria. And so testing those genes one at a time or in groups of a few can be very costly and a very drawn-out process. Another patients that considers whole exome sequencing are patients with non-specific features, such as intellectual disability. There have been over 1,000 genes that have been associated with intellectual disability. Sometimes it's a feature of a larger genetic syndrome that has other symptoms associated with it. Sometimes intellectual disability is seen all by itself. So how can you sort through which genetic test to order or where to start? Sometimes going with something as broad as whole exome sequencing is a good choice for patients like that. A group that considers whole exome sequencing is patients who have a genetic disorder that right now doesn't have any other genetic testing associated with it, or doesn't have the gene identified that's causing their features, or has a feature that looks like it might be genetic, but not sure. We'll order a comprehensive genetic test to try and evaluate, does this symptom have a genetic etiology? So see your doctor and they decide to pursue whole exome sequencing. What they'll do is take a sample that involves your DNA. This is typically a blood sample, although it can be a saliva sample or sometimes a different type of sample. But what they want to do is send the laboratory some of your cells that have your DNA in it. So when it comes into the laboratory, it's step number 1 right here, sample preparation, and that's where we take the sample that's sent to us and extract the DNA out of it so that we can do genetic testing. Step number 2 is exome capture, which gathers all of that protein coding regions of your DNA, exome, and that's what we're going to be doing the genetic testing on. We'll then move on to next-gen sequencing, which is a laboratory technique that allows us to do genetic testing of many genes all at the same time. Imagine when we're testing 20,000 genes at one time, we have a large amount of data that's generated. So step number 4 is data analysis. This is we start to look at all of this data and filter through the data and think about what did we find here and what does this mean for the patient. That's hand in hand with step number 5, the clinical review of variants. Steps 4 and 5 are done by geneticists. These are MDs, PhDs, genetic counselors who are specially trained to look at your genetic material and clinical information and try and find genetic changes that could be associated with the clinical symptoms that a person is experiencing. The analyst will then choose some of these variants to be confirmed, which involves another type of sequencing that's a secondary method to confirm any variants that are going to show up in the final report that goes back to the physician and the patient. See, this is a process with a lot of different steps and a lot of different people involved with it. Currently in our laboratory, it's taking 8 to 12 weeks for a sample to sort of make its way through this entire pipeline and to have a result from the time that we receive the sample. It requires several different pieces. We have to have a good quality sample of DNA because we're doing some pretty high technology genetic testing. We need clinical information. We need to understand the symptoms that the patient is experiencing so that we can look at the variants and see what might be related. We generally receive the clinical information via medical records that are sent to us by the doctor who ordered the test. The data analysis and clinical review can take so long is because of this large amount of data that we have. So on average, someone who's undergoing whole exome sequencing will have about 100,000 variants in their DNA identified. Now, variants in your DNA is completely normal. This is part of what makes you unique. It's what makes you different from your friends or from your siblings. And so most of those variants are completely normal, completely benign, and not related to any clinical symptoms. So our job is to find in these 100,000 variants, what are the variants that are actually important? What are the variants that could be contributing to the disease in this patient? We narrow this down by applying several different filters, and that leaves us still with about 200 variants that have to be reviewed one by one to see how they might fit the patient. The process occurs in a couple different ways. First of all, we start with the patient's symptoms. This is a patient with intellectual disability. So we look at the genes that we know are associated with intellectual disability, and we look in those genes for any variants that might be explaining the features in that patient. Each is individually scored and placed somewhere on this spectrum. We divide variants into these 5 different categories, although there is more of a spectrum. We're trying to figure out, is the variant part of normal variation? Is this just a variant that's part of what makes you you? Or is this variant disease-causing? Is this variant pathogenic? And it'd be something that we need to think about when we're thinking about disease. Our lab follows published guidelines that one of our co-founders, Sherry Bale, helped to develop. The guidelines are used by laboratories to help us classify variants and to improve the quality of reported variants, as well as consistency from laboratory to laboratory. Another way that we improve consistency from laboratory to laboratory is to submit our variant information to a database called ClinVar. ClinVar is a free open access database where people submit the variants that they have identified, the classification, and the evidence that they use to come up with that classification. GeneDx is one of the top contributors to this database, and we hope that over time, by sharing this sort of information, we will be able to determine which variants we identify in people are just benign population variation, part of what makes someone unique, as opposed to variants that are pathogenic or disease-causing. We want to be able to put definitively in one side or the other rather than being stuck somewhere else on the spectrum. Gain experience, and we're able to improve that classification process over time. Whole exome sequencing improves over time as well. From left to right, we also analyze all of those variants from right to left. So we're going to start with the variant. Here's a variant that looks like it's pathogenic. It has lots of support to suggest that this could be a disease-causing variant. We'll then look at what gene is this variant located in. Is it located in a known gene that's associated with the patient's symptoms, or is it in one of those unknown or candidate genes? Remember that I told you only a quarter of our genes have a known association with human disease. So we're also looking at those other 15,000 genes to see if there's any support that could suggest that this candidate gene could be associated with the patient's symptoms. This shows our experience with whole exome sequencing overall in our laboratory. To date, we have sequenced over 30,000 exomes and reported over 14,000 reports. So as a whole, we have definitive results in about 28% of cases. This means that we were able to identify a pathogenic variant in a gene that's known to be associated with the patient's symptoms. So these are the cases where we were able to provide a diagnosis back to the patient and their family. This section, this candidate gene section, shows those that were reported in the unknown genes, where we think that there is a reasonable, uneducated guess, pretty much, that this variant could be associated with the symptoms that are seen in the patient. This proportion of our results are these variant of uncertain significance results. You can have variants of uncertain significance results for a couple of different reasons. First of all, this could be a known gene, but the variant itself doesn't have enough evidence to be called pathogenic. So while we know that this gene is associated with intellectual disability and this patient has intellectual disability, the variant doesn't have enough evidence to show that it's a pathogenic or a disease-causing variant, and this could just be normal variation. We could see a definitively pathogenic variant in a gene that we're not sure really relates to the symptoms that the patient is experiencing. So this could be a new presentation for this disorder, or this patient could be experiencing a feature of this disorder that hasn't been described yet. Of uncertain significance results require follow-up through testing of other family members or biochemical testing to investigate if this is truly the diagnosis. After we do this follow-up testing, many variants of uncertain significance results turn out to just be benign variation. So they're not reclassified as pathogenic variants and often get reclassified as likely benign change present in this individual. That it's important to recognize, especially I think as patients and parents, is this negative category. About 1 in 4 of our whole exome sequencing results goes out as negative. What that means is while there were variants that were identified, none of them made a very strong case as being a pathogenic variant that could be related to the clinical symptoms that this patient is experiencing. It's important who's considering whole exome sequencing to understand that while this test is comprehensive and it tests a lot of things, there's still a good chance that the result could come back negative, which can be very frustrating. I'll give you an example of how an unknown gene can turn into a newly recognized syndrome. This is the story of the DDX3X gene. The DDX3X gene was one of those unknown genes. We didn't really know what it did or what happened in patients if you had a disruption of this gene. As we began to have more experience with whole exome sequencing, we noticed a pattern of variants in DDX3X in females with intellectual disability and some combination of these other features shown over here on the right-hand side. GeneDx, as well as 2 other collections of patient data, were able to collaborate and publish a brand new genetic syndrome that variants in DDX3X can cause symptoms such as these listed here, they were able to describe 38 females with this new genetic disorder, moving the DDX3X gene from one of those unknown genes into a newly described genetic syndrome. This is a picture from that publication that shows many of the girls who were described in this new syndrome. And though they have differing ages and ethnic backgrounds, they have similar features and similar clinical symptoms that are likely related to their DDX3X variant. Following of this syndrome, the Clinic for Special Children hosted a family day for girls with DDX3X gene variants. The families were able to get together, meet one another, learn about the DDX3X gene and what it does in the human body, as well as share about their daughters and some of their shared experiences. As quoted in this media article referenced on the slide, one mom said, quote, "I always wondered for so many years if there was something I could have done. What is wrong? And I didn't have any answers. The diagnosis brought closure. Now I know there's nothing I could have done." End quote. We hope that as our experience with whole exome sequencing improves, we can move more genes from this unknown candidate gene status into known genes and syndromes that would allow us to provide a diagnosis for more of our patients and support for their families. In addition to making a diagnosis, whole exome sequencing can also be used to identify incidental or secondary findings. Findings are variants in genes that are medically actionable with severe but preventable outcomes. Examples include some inherited cancer syndromes, inherited cardiac diseases, and susceptibility to malignant hyperthermia. The College of Medical Genetics issued a formal policy statement recommending that anyone having whole exome sequencing should also be offered that we report variants present in these genes, even if the patient has no symptoms to suggest that they have this condition at this time. And most whole exome sequencing laboratories review these genes as part of our analysis, but we do allow patients to opt out if they desire. Sequencing is a powerful tool to make a diagnosis and identify secondary findings. It still has limitations. The scientific knowledge available about the function of genes in the human genome is just not complete at this time. The majority of recognized genes we don't know have not been associated with a human disease. And for this reason, whole exome sequencing may identify a variant in one of those genes, but they can't recognize it as the cause of the disease due to this insufficient knowledge. In addition, whole exome sequencing does not reliably detect certain types of variants that are known to cause disease. For this reason, your doctor may suggest additional genetic testing on whole exome sequencing. Limitations. Whole exome sequencing can limit the diagnostic odyssey for some patients. So we're starting to talk about ordering whole exome sequencing as the first genetic test rather than after other genetic testing. This paper that came out of Australia showed a diagnostic rate of 58% in babies who were tested with whole exome sequencing, compared to only 14% of patients who received a diagnosis via sort of normal genetic workup. Of the patients that received a diagnosis, 1 in 3 reported that the diagnosis changed their clinical care. I hope exome sequencing can have a significant impact on medical management of the patient, confirm a suspected diagnosis, and provide information for families. Literature supporting the clinical utility of whole exome sequencing is abundant and still emerging. I see a quote from a physician interviewed for this paper here sums much of what we've been talking There's an enormous need for whole exome sequencing. The literature is starting to come out now with quite a robust diagnostic rate. And typically, we have patients with either nonspecific presentations or incredibly complicated presentations. It's not for bad clinicians to not be able to make the diagnosis. It's just that there's a limit with what we can come up with. Although with limitations, whole exome sequencing is a powerful tool for patients with rare diseases. Let's go back to KB and find out what her whole exome sequencing showed. Back to Amanda to follow up.
You need to unmute yourself.
Talking and completing. Thank you for the reminder. So a few months after KB's physicians ordered whole exome sequencing, they received the results and was able to identify a diagnosis for KB. Testing showed that she inherited pathogenic changes in a gene called NUBPL from both mom and from dad. Next. What is NUBPL? And is a newly discovered mitochondrial gene, and the mitochondria are the power plants for your cells. Problems with the mitochondria can result in problems with the body that require the most energy, specifically your muscles and your brain. So NUBPL lead to a type of mitochondrial disorder called complex 1 deficiency, which means mitochondria have problems producing enough energy for every cell. NUBPL is a very rare type of mitochondrial disorder, so only a few patients have ever been described. But those patients sound a lot like KB. They have problems with moving, like problems with balance and coordination and muscle weakness, and other developmental concerns. Next. Diagnosis changed everything for KB and her family. They went from having a progressive terminal illness to one where her family has a hope for the future. And while we don't know exactly what the future holds for KB and family, individuals with NUBPL can live into adulthood. This diagnosis also changed KB's medical management. She started cocktail of supplements and medications, started avoiding other medications, and was able to enroll in a clinical trial just for mitochondrial disorders. Additionally, and her family found another community. They found their families with mitochondrial disorders caused by NUBPL and have started a website to educate us on their daughter's very rare disorder and to find and support other families. Next. What have we learned today? First, that whole exome sequencing is a very comprehensive genetic test that's able to find a diagnosis in more than 1 in 4 patients. Second, that whole exome is a useful test for many patients with a variety of symptoms, from autism to intellectual disability to mitochondrial disorders. It's also been a useful test for patients both at the very beginning and end of their diagnostic odyssey. Third, whole exome is a powerful test and will continue to improve as our understanding of genetics improves. Genetically advancing area of medicine, and we're proud to contribute to the field and help patients find their diagnoses. So I know I covered a lot of material today, so I'll hand the presentation back to Lorna for questions. But for more information for finding a genetic counselor, to learn more about whole exome sequencing, you can visit sgc.org, the National Society of Genetic Counselors, or our website, genedx.com. Thank you.
This was a very, very helpful. I know how complex this subject is, but I think you both did a wonderful job explaining it and really laying out how this process works and what difference it can make to patients and parents. So let's think about the parent. So the parent has a child and like KB, what is their role in terms of seeking out type of diagnostic technique in relation to the physicians, how should they go about this process? Stephanie?
I can answer that. Parents and patients are often the strongest advocates that they have for themselves and for their children. And patients are interested in finding more about whole exome sequencing and if that's the best test for them. We do recommend that they discuss it with their physicians, and those physicians can help guide them through the process or refer them to somebody else who can. Geneticists and genetic counselors are available throughout the country.
Very good. Does anyone on the line want to ask any questions? I think you should be able to pick up. Making sure it is. Do keep background noise to a minimum time. So if we don't have any questions on that, so tell me a little bit about the interaction between the physician and the genetic counselor. Do the physicians have to make contact? Does the patient or parent have to go to a physician, find a physician, and then they would contact the lab? How does it work?
GeneDx testing to be ordered by either a physician or another qualified healthcare provider. So most of the time, that's a genetic counselor. But in terms of finding a genetic counselor, depending on insurance and whatnot, it depends. But most of the time, physicians can refer directly to genetic counselors, or if an individual is interested, they can contact a genetic services provider. So contact a genetic counselor directly to set up an appointment or get the referrals that they need in place.
Someone has asked, what are costs associated with the whole genome sequence assay? What costs are typically involved?
So whole exome sequencing is one of the most complicated genetic tests that is available, so it is an expensive test. But the exact price of it, if you're going through insurance, varies from provider to provider. But GeneDx can bill commercial insurances in the United States, and our customer service team is wonderful, and they're very proactive trying to contact the patient if the expected out-of-pocket costs are going to be more than $100, and if those costs are burdensome, we also have need-based financial assistance programs. And you can find more about the billing policy and paying for whole exome sequencing on the GeneDx website by searching for exome billing policy in the search bar.
What types of patients might this technique not be helpful for?
For any individual patient, the best person to ask is their doctor about that, because it's hard for me to say generally this would be or would not be helpful, but genetic counselors specialize in risk assessment tailored to an individual patient. So I would refer anybody to start there. In general, exome sequencing might not be needed for someone who already has a genetic diagnosis. It may not be helpful for patients who have common disease as opposed to rare disease. So for example, something like adult onset diabetes is often due to not just one genetic change. There may be many genetic changes, and this testing is really designed for rare diseases where there's one or two genetic changes that explain the symptoms that the patient is experiencing.
Any other questions from the audience, the participants? There was a slide where there was a proportion of patients that got negative results. What do these negative results mean? Does that mean they don't have the disease or a genetic disease, or is it really that we don't have enough information, scientific understanding yet to really tease out those that do have some sort of disease? It's based on the data, I presume. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I think that it is more the latter. I think that our knowledge is limited at this point. And so, as I mentioned, we see variants in every person, but we're trying to figure out, are those variants actually clinically significant? And so we are limited by our understanding of genetics at this point in terms of how significant the individual variant is and how important that gene is in our body's function, and what interrupting that gene could actually cause in a patient. So all of those are limitations, and so we could call something negative just because our science isn't good enough to recognize it at this point. In addition, there are other types of genetic changes that are not covered by this test. So the patient may have a genetic disorder that this test just can't detect at this time. I think in the future there will be other genetic testing that becomes available that may be able to make diagnoses for some of those patients that originally receive a negative diagnosis, or negative test result, excuse me.
Okay. And one question we have is from the audience: do the assay results provide the specifics of the gene mutation?
So the way the information is reported will vary a little bit from laboratory to laboratory, but the lab result will say the gene, the actual DNA change, what it should have been, what it reads in this individual, and then we'll give you some sort of interpretation of why we think this change that we found in the DNA could be associated with the symptoms that that patient is experiencing. So all of that will be detailed in the report. I work on these reports every day, and they're several pages long usually, so it's a complicated process to lay all of that out, and can be difficult to understand, which is why we try to have genetic counselors available to walk through that complicated medical information with families.
Okay. And you did mention the 56 disease, the number 56. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I believe that that is a way of trying to build up this database. Can you expand on that?
I can. So the 56 diseases don't specifically relate to a database, but those disorders, those 56 diseases, are recommended by the American College of Medical Genetics that anyone who's undergoing exome sequencing, it's sort of like an ethics recommendation. We ethically recommend that if someone with intellectual disability is having whole exome sequencing, even if they don't have breast cancer right now, if they have a pathogenic variant in a BRCA1 gene, you should tell them about that, because you have that information by testing all 20,000 genes. And although based on their symptoms, you wouldn't necessarily look at that gene, recommend ethically that you provide that information to them so that they can take steps in their own health and in their family's health if they desire. So that's sort of the thinking behind that recommendation. And as we mentioned, families can opt out of that information if they don't want to have results that are not related to the symptoms that the patient is experiencing.
Mm-hmm. What proportion roughly of patients might not, or people not want to know additional information, and why is that? Is it related to insurance issues, or what's the issue here?
I think the reasons for opting out of that information are varied and personal. Sometimes people are concerned about insurance coverage, although there is some legislation to protect from that. Sometimes families just don't feel that that they want to have additional information. They already have so much on their plate that having something else added that's unrelated is something that they just don't want to pursue at this time. It's the minority, I think, of patients. It is the minority of cases that we receive where they opt out. Most people decide to receive this information, but I think that sort of goes hand in hand with the people that are pursuing this technology. So you are a patient who's having a genetic test that's going to look at 20,000 genes. So of that, we're going to look at these 56 disorders in addition, and most people want the information. They're information seekers, and they would want to know that information if it's available. So, but people do choose to opt out for a variety of reasons.
Right, very helpful. Well, I think we've come to the end of our questions, and unless there are more questions from the audience, we're going to go into a little bit more information about the organization. So we'll just give a few moments just in case there are questions that people want to ask. We go into auditors, just go into who's on the board. So we have John Gilbert. He's the VP of Marketing, Public Relations, and Social Media. And maybe we'll hear about the organization and the webinars and our blogs and everything like that through his efforts and the effort of someone who's helping him called Rohan. And we have a direct-to-patient strategy because we want to get the information right to the people who need it, the patients and parents. So we're not going through filters. And I don't know how many of you have support groups, but if you could basically ensure that your support groups are aware about what we're doing. And because one of the challenges we're finding is that as we try to go information out there, get as many people to be aware of this type of information, a lot of the groups that are there to serve the patients don't actually want to pass the information on to patients to let them know there is this type of information that they can access. They want to be the ones to access it, and then they will then decide if it's appropriate to tell the patients. And we think that's the wrong approach. We think patients and parents are intelligent enough to decide if they want to access this information because they can make use of it. And often we found that patients and parents have said that when they need the information, if they're in a crisis and something's happening and they really need answers, they can't get hold of the people in many of these more professional type organizations, which is why they've set up patient support groups themselves on social media. So we're definitely trying to interact with the more professional foundations, but also patient support groups, the parent support groups. And Patricia is VP of Patient Liaison, is the person who is responsible for liaising with the patient groups. Leah is quite new. She's our treasurer, and I'm the founder and president. As I mentioned, this is the book that was written quite a while ago, 2010, and it is a resource for people who are involved with the clinical trial process. Actually, a lot of professionals use it, but also it was specifically written for patients and parents of various diseases, not just rare diseases. It's a very important research and resource, and it has information as well as questions to ask physicians at various points and for people involved with the clinical trial process. So this is our website. It's quite new, but there is a database on there. If you would put your details into the database, we don't share your information, but allows us to keep in touch with you. So if you put your information into the orange circle, that goes into a database which allows us to keep in touch. There's also a newsletter for putting your information, and we will put a place for you to register for any upcoming webinars, any future upcoming webinars. And we have a Twitter feed, and there is a blog as well. So very much for your time today. I hope you found it useful, and we hope to connect with you at a future time. Thank you very much.